October 21st, 1888. The New York Academy of Music. The theater is packed. 2,000 people have paid good money to be here tonight, and they're divided almost perfectly down the middle. Half of them are here to cheer. The other half are here to hiss and jeer. The air is electric with anticipation and anger. On the stage, a single chair, a single wooden stool, and a woman dressed entirely in black. Her name is Margaret Fox Kane, though most people know her simply as Maggie Fox. She is 55 years old, though she looks older. Her face is lined with decades of hard living, with alcohol and grief, and something else. Something that looks like exhaustion mixed with relief. She has been carrying a weight for 40 years. Tonight, she is going to put it down. She stands before the crowd, and the noise in the theater grows louder. Some people are shouting encouragement. Others are screaming accusations. She waits for the din to quiet just enough, and then she speaks. I am here tonight as one of the founders of Spiritualism, she says, her voice carrying through the vast hall, to denounce it as an absolute falsehood from beginning to end, as the flimsiest of superstitions, the most wicked blasphemy known to the world. The theater erupts. Half the crowd cheers. The other half roars with rage. In the audience, sitting in the front row, is her sister Kate, younger than Maggie by 3 years, but looking just as worn, just as broken. She does not speak, but her presence is support. They are in this together, just as they have been from the very beginning. Maggie waits for the noise to die down again. Then she continues. My sister Katie and myself were very young children when this horrible deception began, she says. At night, when we went to bed, we used to tie an apple on a string and move the string up and down, causing the apple to bump on the floor, or we would drop the apple on the floor, making a strange noise every time it would rebound. Mother listened to this for a time. She would not understand it and did not suspect us as being capable of a trick because we were so young. She pauses. The theater is quieter now. People are leaning forward, desperate to hear every word. And then, Maggie says, we discovered we could do something even better. She walks to the chair, sits down, and reaches for her right foot. Slowly, deliberately, she removes her shoe, then her stocking. She places her bare foot on the wooden stool so that everyone can see. The theater holds its breath. And then, from somewhere, from everywhere and nowhere, comes a sound. Rap. A sharp, clear knock, loud enough to echo through the silent hall. Rap, rap, rap. People gasp. Some stand up to get a better view because they can see clearly that Maggie's foot is the only thing touching the stool. There are no hidden devices, no assistance beneath the stage, just her bare foot. And every time her big toe moves, just slightly, just a fraction, another rap sounds. Crack, crack, crack. It is her joints, her toe joints, popping and cracking with a sound that, in the silence and acoustics of a large theater, becomes loud enough to hear from the back row. The sound that launched a religion, the sound that made her and her sister the most famous mediums in the world. The sound that convinced millions of people that the dead could speak. The sound of a lie. Doctors from the audience are invited on stage. They examine her foot, verify that the sound is indeed coming from her joints. There is no trick, Or rather, the trick is so simple that it barely qualifies as a trick at all. It's just a teenage girl who learned how to crack her toes. The New York Herald will later describe the scene this way. There stood a black-robed, sharp-faced widow, working her big toe and solemnly declaring that it was in this way she created the excitement that has driven so many persons to suicide or insanity. One moment it was ludicrous, the next it was weird. Before she leaves the stage, Maggie makes one final statement. She points toward the audience, toward the spiritualist leaders who have made fortunes from the movement she started, and she says, "I regard spiritualism as one of the greatest curses that the world has ever known." And then she walks off the stage. The newspapers the next day will call it the death blow to spiritualism. They will say that the Fox sisters' confession has destroyed the movement, exposed the fraud, ended the era of mediums and seances and spirit communication. But they will be wrong, because here is the twist. The thing that makes this story so much stranger and darker than a simple tale of fraud and confession: nobody believed her. The spiritualists, millions of them, simply refused to accept the confession. They said Maggie was lying now, not then. They said she was a genuine medium who was being forced by evil spirits, or by greedy reporters, or by her own bitterness, to deny her gifts. They said the confession itself was the hoax, and the movement she tried to destroy, it didn't die. If anything, it grew stronger. Within a year, Maggie herself would recant her confession, insist she was a medium after all. But by then, it didn't matter. The truth and the lie were so tangled together that no one could tell them apart anymore. This is the story of how that lie was born, how two little girls in a farmhouse playing a prank on their mother accidentally created one of the most influential religious movements of the modern age, how their innocence was weaponized, how their childhood joke became a prison that they would never escape. This is not just a story about fraud, it's a story about what we believe and why we believe it. It's a story about grief and hope and the desperate human need to know that death is not the end. It's a story about two sisters who gave people exactly what they wanted to hear and then spent the rest of their lives paying for it. Before we go back to the beginning, I want to ask you something. If you believe these dark histories, these strange tales of how we deceive ourselves and each other, are worth remembering, if you believe that the truth, no matter how uncomfortable, should not be forgotten, you can help us continue this work by liking this video and subscribing. Your support keeps the candle lit and allows us to keep exploring the shadows. Tonight, we will go back to where it all began, to a cold March night in 1848, to a tiny farmhouse in upstate New York, to two young girls lying in bed in the darkness, listening to their mother's frightened footsteps, and realizing with a thrill of both excitement and terror that their little prank had worked far better than they ever intended. We will watch as a joke becomes a phenomenon, as a phenomenon becomes a movement, as a movement becomes an industry built on grief and false hope. We will follow Maggie and Kate Fox from childhood innocence through fame, exploitation, addiction, and finally to that stage in 1888 where Maggie tried desperately to tell the truth and found that the world preferred the lie. Welcome to the Midnight Archives. Hydesville, New York, March 1848. If you drive through western New York today, past Rochester, heading toward the small town of Newark, you might pass through what was once the hamlet of Hydesville. It's not much of a place. It never was. In 1848, it was barely a collection of houses clustered along a country road, maybe 50 people total, most of them farmers or craftsmen, living quiet, unremarkable lives. The Fox family cottage sat on that road, a small wooden structure with one bedroom and a few cramped common rooms. It was old, drafty, and cold in March. The kind of place where every creak of the boards and rattle of the shutters sounded loud in the night silence. John Fox, the father, was a blacksmith, a practical man with practical explanations for everything. His wife, Margaret, was very different. She was a devout Methodist, superstitious, fearful of the dark, and of things she didn't understand. Their older children had grown and moved away, but their two youngest daughters were still at home. Margaretta, called Maggie, was 14 years old. Some accounts say she was even younger, maybe 11 or 12. The exact ages are disputed, tangled in later revisions and lies. But what's certain is that she was a young teenager, still a child in many ways. Catherine, called Kate, was 11, though again, some sources say she was younger, small for her age, with dark eyes that seemed too large for her thin face. These were not sophisticated children. They had almost no formal education. Their world was the cottage, the road, the nearby farms. They knew how to do chores, how to help their mother, how to stay out of their father's way. And they knew how to entertain themselves in the long, dark evenings when there was nothing else to do. And that's where our story truly begins. Not with spirits or the supernatural, but with boredom. According to Maggie's confession 40 years later, and we have to be careful here, because by 1888, memory and truth had become slippery things. The prank started, innocently enough. The girls shared a bed in their parents' room. At night, after their mother and father had blown out the candles, they would lie awake in the darkness, and to amuse themselves, to stave off boredom, they would play tricks. One of their favorite tricks was simple. They would tie an apple to a piece of string, dangle it over the side of the bed, and let it bounce on the wooden floor. Thump, thump, thump. In the small, echoing cottage, the sound was loud and strange. Their mother, lying in the darkness, would hear it and wonder what it was. A loose shutter, a branch hitting the house, something else. The girls would stifle their giggles and wait for her to investigate, but then they discovered something even better. They discovered that they could crack their joints, their knuckles, their toes, even their ankles, and produce sharp popping sounds. And if they did it just right, pressing their feet against the bed frame or the floor, the sounds would echo and reverberate, becoming louder and stranger. Most people can crack their knuckles a few times before the joints need to settle again. But some people, especially young people with flexible joints, can do it over and over. And with practice, with practice, you can learn to crack specific joints on command. You can learn to do it silently, without any visible movement. You can make it into an art form. The Fox sisters, lying in bed night after night, became artists. Throughout March 1848, the sounds continued. Every night, the strange thumps and raps would echo through the cottage. John Fox, practical and skeptical, was sure there was a mundane explanation. A loose board, a shutter rattling in the wind. Perhaps a small animal had gotten into the walls. He searched but found nothing. He assured his wife it was nothing to worry about, but Margaret Fox was not convinced. The sounds seemed to follow no pattern. They came at odd hours. They would stop when John searched for their source, then resume as soon as he gave up. Something was wrong. Something was in the house. She could feel it. And the girls, lying in their bed, listening to their mother's growing fear, realized something that was both thrilling and terrifying. They had power. The power to frighten. The power to create mystery. The power to make adults, confused and scared. What started as simple mischief was becoming something more intoxicating. By the end of March, the Fox family was exhausted. The strange sounds had robbed them of sleep for weeks. Margaret was on the edge of hysteria. John was frustrated and baffled. The girls themselves were tired. Keeping up the prank night after night was harder than it looked. And then came March 31st, 1848. The night that would change everything. The Foxes decided to go to bed early that evening. It was barely dark, perhaps 6 o'clock, but they were so tired that they just wanted to sleep. The girls were bundled into their bed. Margaret and John climbed into theirs. The candles were blown out. The cottage fell into silence, and immediately, the sounds began. Rap, rap, rap. Margaret Fox sat up in the darkness. "Not again," she whispered. She fumbled for a candle, lit it, and began to search the room. She looked under the bed, behind the furniture, at the windows. Nothing. The sounds continued. Rap, rap, rap. She returned to the girl's bed, holding the candle, looking down at her daughters. Maggie and Kate stared back at her, eyes wide, faces the picture of frightened innocence. And then Kate, peering past her mother into the dark corners of the room, did something that changed history. She spoke to the darkness. "Mr. Splitfoot," she said, using an old folk name for the devil, "do as I do." She snapped her fingers in a rhythm. Snap, snap, snap. And from the darkness came the response. Rap, 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 in the exact same rhythm. Margaret gasped. Kate, emboldened, snapped her fingers 4 times. 4 raps answered. Then Maggie clapped her hands. The raps responded in kind. And then, and this is the crucial moment, Kate made soundless gestures with her fingers, pretending to snap, but making no noise. And still the raps came. Still the sounds echoed through the room. This was the moment when a prank became a performance, because the girls had practiced enough that they could produce the raps without any visible movement. They could crack their toes while lying perfectly still under the blankets. They could control the sounds, vary the rhythm, make it seem like the raps were coming from different parts of the room. To Margaret Fox, terrified and exhausted and deeply superstitious, there was only one explanation. There was a spirit in her house, and her daughters, her innocent little daughters, could speak to it. What happened next was a combination of panic, excitement, and snowballing belief that would be almost funny if the consequences hadn't been so profound. Margaret began asking questions. "How many children have I had?" 7 raps. Margaret had given birth to 7 children, though only 6 were living. The 7th had died in infancy. She had never mentioned this to the neighbors. How could the girls know? The answer, of course, is that they did know. Children hear everything, but in the moment, it seemed impossible. "How old am I?" The raps counted out her age, then John's age, then each child's age. John Fox, hearing this, came over from his bed. He was skeptical, but intrigued. "If you're a spirit," he said to the air, "rap twice." 2 raps. "Are you a good spirit?" Silence. "Are you an evil spirit?" Rap, rap. The hair on Margaret's neck stood up, and then the neighbors arrived. Someone, probably Margaret herself, had run to the nearest house, gasping about spirits and strange sounds. In a small community like Hydesville, news traveled fast. Within an hour, the small cottage was packed with people. Neighbors, friends, the curious and the skeptical, all crowding into the bedroom to witness this strange phenomenon. The girls, lying in their bed, must have been terrified. What had been a private prank was now a public spectacle. But they couldn't stop now. They couldn't suddenly confess. So they continued. The visitors began asking questions, and the spirit answered them all, through a simple code, 1 rap for yes, 2 for no, or rapping out numbers. The spirit told a story. It claimed to be the ghost of a peddler named Charles Rossner. It said he had been murdered in this very house 5 years earlier by a previous occupant. His body, it said, was buried in the cellar. Where did this story come from? Later investigations suggested that there had been rumors about a peddler who disappeared years ago, rumors the girls had probably overheard. Or perhaps they made it up on the spot, the way children tell stories, adding details as they go. Or perhaps the neighbors, asking leading questions, essentially told the story to themselves while the girls just rapped yes or no at appropriate moments. Whatever the truth, the story was compelling and terrifying. The next day, a group of men took shovels into the Fox cottage cellar and began to dig. They were looking for Charles Rossner's body. They dug until they hit water. The cellar was poorly drained and quickly flooded. They found nothing conclusive. Some claimed to see bone fragments or teeth, but nothing that could be definitively identified as human remains. The failure to find a body should have ended the story right there, should have raised questions, should have led to skepticism. Instead, it did the opposite. Because people wanted to believe. The idea that these 2 innocent girls could communicate with a murdered man's spirit was so much more interesting, so much more meaningful than the alternative. It suggested that death was not the end, that the dead could speak, that there was proof, empirical, testable proof of life after death. Within days, the story had spread across the county. Within a week, people were traveling from nearby towns to visit the Fox cottage and hear the rappings for themselves. The family was overwhelmed, strangers appearing at all hours, demanding demonstrations, asking questions of the spirits. The girls tried at one point to stop. Kate reportedly told her mother, "Tomorrow is April Fool's Day. This must be a joke." It was as close to a confession as she could manage, but Margaret didn't understand, or didn't want to understand. And then, in early April, a letter arrived from Rochester. It was from Leah Fox Fish, the eldest sister. She was 35 years old, a divorced woman living with her young daughter and supporting herself by giving music lessons, a precarious existence for a woman alone in 1848. She had heard the stories about Maggie and Kate. She had read the pamphlets and newspaper accounts that were already beginning to circulate. And Leah, unlike her parents, unlike the believers and the curious and the frightened, saw the situation clearly, not as a miracle, not as a horror, but as an opportunity. She wrote to her parents and asked them to send Maggie and Kate to Rochester. Just for a visit, she said. Just to get them away from the chaos in Hydesville, to give them some rest and normalcy. Margaret and John, exhausted and overwhelmed, agreed. They sent their daughters to their eldest sister, grateful for the help. They had no idea what they had just done. Because Leah Fox Fish was about to turn her little sisters into the most famous mediums in America, she was about to transform a childhood prank into an industry. She was about to take two girls who had cracked their toes to scare their mother and turn them into the founders of a new religion. Maggie and Kate, sitting in the carriage that would take them to Rochester, had no idea that they would never really come home again, that their lives, from this moment forward, would not belong to them, that the lie they had told as a joke would become a cage they could never escape. They were just children. They were just trying to have a little fun in the darkness. They could not have known that the darkness would consume them. To understand how two girls cracking their toe joints could launch a religious movement, you need to understand where and when this happened. Because Hydesville, New York, in 1848, was not some random location. It was, in many ways, the perfect place for spiritualism to be born. Western New York, in the mid-19th century, had a nickname: the Burned Over District. It was called this because the region had been burned over by so many waves of religious revival that the metaphorical timber was used up. Starting in the 1790s and continuing through the 1840s, this area had been the epicenter of American religious fervor. Preachers moved from town to town, holding massive outdoor revivals where thousands of people would gather to be saved, to speak in tongues, to experience direct religious ecstasy. This was the landscape of the Second Great Awakening, a period when American Christianity was being reinvented, democratized, made personal and emotional rather than institutional and intellectual. And Western New York was ground zero. This was where Mormonism was born. In 1827, just 20 years before the Fox sisters' rappings, Joseph Smith claimed to have found golden plates in Palmyra, New York, less than 20 miles from Hydesville. His visions of the angel Moroni and his translation of the Book of Mormon created an entirely new American religion. By 1848, the Mormons had fled to Utah, but their legacy remained. Proof that new prophets and new revelations could emerge from upstate New York farmland. This was where the Millerites had predicted the end of the world. In the early 1840s, a farmer named William Miller calculated that Jesus Christ would return to Earth on October 22nd, 1844. Tens of thousands of followers sold their possessions and gathered on hilltops to await the second coming. When it didn't happen, an event that became known as the Great Disappointment, many believers were devastated, but they didn't stop believing in direct divine revelation. They just recalibrated. This was where the Shakers had established communes, where utopian societies sprang up like mushrooms, where every variant of Christianity and post-Christianity was being tested and tried. The people of Western New York were not simple-minded or gullible. They were hungry for religious experience, hungry for proof that God was real and active in the world, hungry for something more than dry sermons and distant theology. They wanted to feel God. They wanted to see miracles. They wanted direct, personal, undeniable proof that the spiritual world was real. And into this hunger walked Maggie and Kate Fox, offering exactly that. But there was more to it than just religious fervor. There were other currents flowing through the 1840s America that would feed into spiritualism. One was mesmerism. Franz Anton Mesmer was an 18th century Austrian physician who proposed a theory of animal magnetism, an invisible force that flowed through all living things. Mesmer believed that illness was caused by blockages in this magnetic flow, and that trained practitioners could manipulate the magnetic forces through hand gestures and focused will, inducing a trance-like state in patients. By the 1840s, mesmerism had become wildly popular in America. Mesmerists traveled from town to town, giving public demonstrations where they would hypnotize volunteers, who would then perform strange feats, speaking in languages they didn't know, describing distant places they'd never seen, demonstrating seemingly superhuman strength. Most of this was stagecraft and suggestion, but it established something important: the idea that there were invisible forces, that trained individuals could access hidden powers, and that science could prove spiritual truths. This opened the door for spiritualism's central claim, that the invisible world of spirits could be contacted through scientific, testable methods. Another key influence was the writings of Emanuel Swedenborg, an 18th century Swedish scientist and mystic. Swedenborg claimed to have spent years traveling through heaven and hell, speaking with angels and spirits, learning the secrets of the afterlife. His voluminous writings described the spirit world in exact scientific detail, not as vague religious metaphor, but as a real place with physical laws. Swedenborg's ideas were hugely influential in the 1840s America. They suggested that the boundary between the living and the dead was thin, permeable, crossable. And then there was Andrew Jackson Davis, the Poughkeepsie seer. Davis was a young man from New York who, in the mid-1840s, began giving trance lectures while under mesmeric influence. He claimed to channel the spirits of ancient sages, including Swedenborg himself. In 1847, just 1 year before the Fox sisters' rappings, Davis published a massive book called The Principles of Nature, Her Divine Revelations, and A Voice to Mankind. In it, he made a prophecy. It is a truth that spirits commune with one another while one is in the body and the other in the higher spheres. All the world will hail with delight the ushering in of that era when the interiors of men will be opened and the spiritual communication will be established. He predicted, in other words, that the age of spirit communication was about to begin. Davis would later claim that his prophecy came true on March 31st, 1848, the exact night of the Fox sisters' first séance. Now, we should be skeptical of this claimed timing. Davis was a showman, and he may have adjusted his dates after the fact to make his prophecy seem more impressive. But true or not, the coincidence illustrates something important. The Fox sisters did not create spiritualism out of nothing. They emerged into a culture that was primed, ready, desperate for exactly what they were offering. And then there was grief. This cannot be overstated. 19th century America was a place of profound, constant loss. Infant mortality was staggering. Nearly 1 in 5 children died before their first birthday, and many more before age 5. Diseases like cholera, typhoid, and tuberculosis killed without warning. Women frequently died in childbirth. Men died from accidents, from infection, from 1,000 causes that are easily treatable today. Almost every family had buried children. Almost every adult had lost siblings, parents, friends. Death was not an occasional tragedy. It was a constant companion. And the dominant Christian theology of the time offered cold comfort. Calvinist Protestantism emphasized that salvation was predetermined, that God's will was inscrutable, that the dead were either in heaven or hell, and we could never know which. There was no contact, no communication, no way to know if your dead child was okay. This was unbearable to many people, especially women who had lost children. Spiritualism promised something revolutionary. You can speak to them. You can know they're okay. Death is not the end of the relationship. Your child is still there, just on the other side of a thin veil, and with the right medium, you can hear their voice again. This was not a minor comfort. This was everything. Finally, we need to understand the social reform movements that were centered in Western New York. This was the heart of the abolitionist movement. Frederick Douglass published his newspaper, The North Star, in Rochester. The Underground Railroad ran through the area. Passionate reformers were fighting to end slavery. This was also the birthplace of the women's rights movement. The famous Seneca Falls Convention, where the Declaration of Sentiments demanding women's suffrage was signed, took place in July 1848, just 4 months after the Fox sisters' rappings began. These progressive reformers, abolitionists, women's rights advocates, temperance activists, were looking for new forms of religion that matched their progressive politics. Traditional churches were too conservative, too patriarchal, too accepting of slavery and oppression. Spiritualism offered something different. The spirits, it turned out, were progressive. They supported abolition. They supported women's rights. They said that all souls were equal, that the social hierarchies of earth meant nothing in the spirit world. And crucially, spiritualism had no priests, no established clergy, no male hierarchy. Anyone could be a medium. In fact, most mediums were women. Spiritualism was a religious movement where women could be leaders, could have authority, could speak in public without being condemned. For progressive reformers, spiritualism was not just a curiosity, it was a tool for social change. All of these currents, religious hunger, mesmerism, Swedenborg's writings, Davis's prophecies, grief and loss, social reform, were flowing through Western New York in the 1840s. They were creating a perfect storm, a cultural moment when something new was about to emerge. And then, Maggie and Kate Fox, two girls who just wanted to scare their mother, accidentally lit the match that set everything ablaze. In May 1848, just weeks after the rappings began, a man named E. Lewis visited Hydesville to investigate. Lewis was an attorney from the nearby town of Canandaigua, and he approached the Fox case like a lawyer gathering evidence. He interviewed the neighbors. He questioned former tenants of the house. He asked John and Margaret Fox to describe, in their own words, exactly what had happened. Then he published a pamphlet, a report of the mysterious noises heard in the house of John D. Fox. This pamphlet spread like wildfire. It was reprinted in newspapers across the state. People read it in their parlors and over dinner tables. They discussed it in taverns and churches. And they wondered, could it be true? Could these children really speak to the dead? And when the story reached Rochester, when Leah Fox Fish read about her little sisters in the newspapers, she knew exactly what it meant. It meant opportunity. In June 1848, Maggie and Kate arrived in Rochester to stay with their eldest sister. They must have been relieved to get away from Hydesville, from the constant crowds and questions and chaos. They probably thought they were going to have a nice, quiet visit with Leah. They had no idea what she had planned for them, because Leah Fox Fish was nothing like her parents. She was sophisticated, educated, ambitious. She had lived in Rochester for years, mixing with intellectuals and reformers. She knew how the world worked, she knew how money was made, and she knew how to manage a performance. Within days of the girls' arrival, the rappings began again at Leah's house. Or rather, Leah made sure that people knew the rappings had begun again. She invited friends and neighbors. She held small seances in her parlor. And word spread. The Fox sisters' gifts had followed them to Rochester. Among the early visitors were Isaac and Amy Post, a Quaker couple who were prominent abolitionists and reformers. The Posts were exactly the kind of educated, progressive people who would be drawn to spiritualism. They attended a seance, heard the raps, asked questions, and became convinced. More importantly, they became advocates. They introduced Maggie and Kate to their circle of reformer friends. They vouched for the sisters' authenticity. They gave the Fox sisters social legitimacy. And Leah, watching all of this, realized that she was sitting on a gold mine. By November 1848, Leah had a plan. She would take her sister's gift public. She would charge admission. She would turn grief and mystery into profit. The stage was set. The audience was ready. And two young girls who had started all of this as a joke were about to become the most famous mediums in America. They would also become prisoners of their own lie. But that realization would come later. For now, there was only the excitement, the crowds, the belief shining in people's eyes, the sense that something world-changing was happening. And in the darkness, late at night when the crowds had gone home, Maggie and Kate lying in their beds, cracking their toes in the silence, wondering how to stop, wondering if they even could. Leah Fox. Fish was 35 years old when her little sisters arrived in Rochester, and she was desperate. Divorce in 1848 was scandalous, especially for a woman. Leah had left her husband years earlier. The reasons are unclear, lost to history, and was raising her young daughter alone. She supported herself by giving piano lessons and teaching music to the children of Rochester's middle class. It was respectable work, barely, but it was precarious. She lived month to month, always one illness or one lost student away from poverty. She had ambition, intelligence, and no good options. A divorced woman in the 1840s America could not run a business, could not own property in her own name, could barely exist in public without a man's protection. The world had no place for her. And then her little sisters showed up, and everything changed. Leah was not like her parents. She did not immediately believe that Maggie and Kate could speak to spirits. She was too practical, too worldly for that. But she also understood something that John and Margaret Fox did not. It didn't matter whether the girls were really communicating with the dead. What mattered was that people believed they were. And people desperately wanted to believe. Leah moved quickly. Within weeks of the girls' arrival, she had integrated herself into their performances. The three sisters became a unit, a family of mediums. Leah positioned herself as the mature, responsible presence, the one who vouched for her younger sister's authenticity, who managed the seances, who gave the whole thing an air of legitimacy. But she also began refining the act. The girls had been making do with simple raps and yes or no answers. Leah taught them how to create more elaborate communications. She developed an alphabet code, one rap for A, two for B, and so on. This was time-consuming, but it allowed the spirits to spell out full messages. It made the seances last longer, and longer seances meant higher fees. Leah also noticed something the girls probably didn't fully understand. People were afraid to test the raps too rigorously. When someone asked a skeptical question or tried to investigate too closely, the spirits would often refuse to communicate, or the raps would grow faint. Leah encouraged this. She taught the girls that they were in control, that they could end a séance if someone was being too aggressive or too skeptical. She was teaching them, in other words, how to manage the audience, how to read people, how to give them what they wanted while maintaining the mystery. By the fall of 1848, Leah had moved her sisters into the home of Isaac and Amy Post, the Quaker abolitionists who had become early believers. The Posts were wealthy, respected, connected. Their home was the center of Rochester's progressive intellectual circle. By having the Fox sisters stay with them, Leah was making a statement. These girls are not carnival frauds. They are respectable. They are genuine. The Posts believed completely. For them, the Fox sisters' rappings were not just a curiosity. They were proof of everything the Posts believed about the spiritual equality of all souls, about direct religious experience, about the possibility of a more just and enlightened world. And the Posts introduced Maggie and Kate to everyone who mattered in Rochester society. The séances moved from the Posts' parlor to larger venues. Small groups became crowds. Free demonstrations became paid events. And then came November 14th, 1849. The night that changed everything. Corinthian Hall was the finest theatre in Rochester. It was where famous lecturers spoke, where concerts were held, where important political rallies took place. Frederick Douglass himself had spoken there. It was a venue for serious, respectable events. And on November 14th, it would host the first public demonstration of spiritualism ever held before a paying audience. Leah had rented the hall. She had advertised in the newspapers. She had set the ticket price high enough to seem exclusive, but low enough to fill the seats. And nearly 400 people showed up. Maggie and Kate sat on the stage, two thin girls in simple dresses, looking small and frightened under the bright lights. Leah stood with them, explaining to the audience what they were about to witness. And then the raps began, in the large hall, with hundreds of people holding their breath. The sounds were dramatic. Sharp cracks that echoed off the walls, raps that seemed to come from the stage floor, from the walls, from everywhere and nowhere. The spirits answered questions from the audience. They spelled out messages. They demonstrated, over and over, that they were real. Some people in the audience were skeptical. Several men stood up and demanded to examine the stage, the floor, the sisters themselves, looking for hidden devices or accomplices. Leah allowed it graciously. The men found nothing. Of course they found nothing. There was nothing to find except two girls who had spent years learning to crack their joints without visible movement. By the end of the evening, most of the audience was convinced. And the next day, newspapers across New York reported on the astounding demonstration at Corinthian Hall. The Fox sisters were famous. Within weeks, they were performing multiple times a week. Other venues in Rochester wanted them. Then came invitations from nearby cities: Buffalo, Syracuse, Albany. By early 1850, Leah decided it was time for the ultimate test: New York City. New York in 1850 was the largest city in America, the center of publishing, theater, commerce, and culture. If the Fox sisters could succeed in New York, they could succeed anywhere. Leah rented rooms in a hotel and set up a schedule of séances. She advertised in the city newspapers, and she prayed that someone important would attend. Someone did. Horace Greeley was one of the most famous men in America. He was the founder and editor of the New York Tribune, one of the country's most influential newspapers. He was a progressive reformer, an abolitionist, and a man intensely interested in new ideas, including spiritualism. Greeley attended a séance. He was impressed, and he wrote about it in the Tribune. With Greeley's endorsement, the Fox sisters became a sensation. New York's intellectual elite began attending their séances. Writers, poets, politicians, reformers, all came to the modest hotel rooms where Maggie and Kate sat in the darkness and communicated with the dead. William Cullen Bryant, America's most famous poet, attended. James Fenimore Cooper, the celebrated novelist. Sojourner Truth, the freed slave and passionate abolitionist. William Lloyd Garrison, founder of the anti-slavery movement. These were not gullible fools. They were educated, intelligent, skeptical people, and they believed, or at least, they wanted to believe. The séances in New York were more elaborate than the early demonstrations in Hydesville. Leah had refined the performance into an art form. The rooms were darkened, but not pitch black, enough light for people to see the sisters, to verify that there was no obvious trickery. Participants sat in a circle, often holding hands, creating a sense of communal experience. Maggie and Kate would sit quietly, eyes closed or staring into the middle distance. Leah would ask questions or invite others to ask, and the raps would answer. But now there were additional phenomena. Tables would tilt, seemingly of their own accord. Objects would move slightly. People would feel cold breezes, as if spirits were passing through the room. Some participants even claimed to feel ghostly touches, fingers brushing their hair, hands on their shoulders. How much of this was suggestion, shared delusion, mass hysteria? How much was Leah's skill at manipulating the environment? Slight movements of the table, carefully timed gusts from a window. How much was simply people wanting so desperately to believe that they convinced themselves they felt or saw things that weren't there? Whatever the mix, it worked. The Fox sisters' séances became the must-attend event for New York's progressive elite, and the money began to pour in. Leah charged substantial fees for private séances, the equivalent of several $100s in today's money. Public demonstrations cost less, but attracted hundreds of people. Between ticket sales, private appointments, and wealthy patrons who simply gave the sisters money, Leah was making more in a month than she had made in a year as a music teacher. For the first time in her adult life, Leah Foxfish had security. She had money. She had power. And she was not about to let it go. As for Maggie and Kate, what were they thinking during all of this? They were teenagers now. Maggie was probably 16 or 17. Kate was 13 or 14. They had been lying about communicating with spirits for 2 years. The lie had started as a joke, escalated into a village sensation, and now had become their entire identity. They were performing multiple séances every day, sitting for hours in darkened rooms, cracking their toes until the joints ached, spelling out messages letter by letter, maintaining the pretense that they were innocent conduits for spirit communication. And they could not stop, because if they confessed now, after 2 years, after Corinthian Hall, after Horace Greeley's endorsement, they would not just embarrass themselves. They would destroy their family. They would make fools of all the intelligent, respectable people who had believed in them. They would admit to a fraud that had gone so far beyond a simple prank that the consequences were unimaginable. They were trapped. Leah controlled every aspect of their lives. She managed their money. They never saw most of it. She arranged their schedule. She told them what to wear, what to say, how to behave. She was their manager, their publicist, their jailer, and she constantly reminded them, "You have a gift. People need you. We're helping them. We're bringing comfort to the grieving. This is important work." But Maggie, at least, was beginning to have doubts. Not about whether the spirits were real, she knew they weren't, but about what they were doing, about the people who came to the seances, desperate to speak to dead children, dead spouses, dead parents, about the money they took from people who could barely afford it. She began to see the grief behind the belief. The hollow-eyed mothers asking, "Is my baby happy? Does she miss me?" The widows asking, "Does he still love me? Does he forgive me?" And Maggie, sitting in the darkness, cracking her toes, spelling out comforting lies. "Yes, yes, he loves you. She's happy. They're at peace." It was beginning to feel less like a performance and more like a sin. But she couldn't stop. None of them could stop. The machine was too big now, moving too fast. Spiritualism was no longer just about the Fox sisters. Other mediums were emerging, claiming similar abilities. Spiritualist churches were forming. A movement was being born. By 1851, there were an estimated 100 professional mediums working in New York alone. By 1855, that number would grow to thousands across America and Europe. The Fox sisters had not just created a fraud. They had created an industry, and that industry was now self-sustaining, feeding on grief and hope and the desperate human need to believe that death was not the end. Leah Fox Fish looked at what she had built and was proud. She had taken two country girls and made them famous. She had made herself wealthy and powerful. She had created something that would outlive all of them. Maggie and Kate looked at what they had become and felt the first stirrings of despair. They were no longer children playing a prank. They were professional liars performing grief for profit, and they were only just beginning to understand the price they would pay for it. By 1852, just 4 years after those first raps in Hydesville, spiritualism had become a phenomenon unlike anything America had seen before. It was more than a fad, more than a curiosity. It was a movement, a religion, an industry. Estimates vary, but by the mid-1850s, there were at least 2 million declared spiritualists in America, possibly more. In a country of about 23 million people, that meant nearly 1 in 10 Americans believed that the living could communicate with the dead. Hundreds of mediums were now working professionally, holding seances in cities and towns across the country. Spiritualist newspapers and journals published regularly. Spiritualist conventions attracted thousands of attendees. Churches and meeting halls were established where believers could gather to practice their faith. And at the center of it all, still, were the Fox sisters. Maggie and Kate had become celebrities in a way that's hard to understand from our modern perspective. They were not just famous, they were venerated. People traveled hundreds of miles to attend their seances. Their testimonials were treated like holy writ. They were proof, living proof, that death was not the end, that the spirit world was real, that love could transcend the grave. But celebrity in the 19th century was a strange, demanding thing. There was no escape from it, no privacy, no ability to just disappear when you wanted to be alone. And for Maggie and Kate, their celebrity was also their prison. They performed constantly, multiple seances each day, often for hours at a time. The physical toll was real. Cracking toe joints repeatedly, maintaining focus and concentration, staying in character as passive, innocent mediums, receiving messages from beyond. But the psychological toll was worse. Every day, grieving people came to them, mothers who had lost children, widows who had lost husbands, parents who had buried teenage sons. The grief was overwhelming, suffocating, constant. And Maggie and Kate, sitting in darkened rooms, told them what they wanted to hear. Your son is happy. Your wife watches over you. Your baby girl is singing with the angels. These were not neutral performances. These were lies told to people in the deepest pain of their lives. And for someone with any conscience, which Maggie, at least, clearly had, this was corrosive to the soul. There are accounts from this period of Maggie breaking down after particularly difficult seances, of Kate drinking wine to calm her nerves before performing, of both sisters becoming more withdrawn, more reluctant, more obviously unhappy despite their fame and success. Leah, meanwhile, was thriving. She had become a leader in the spiritualist movement, writing books, giving lectures, managing not just her sisters, but other mediums as well. She had remarried to a wealthy man who gave her social status and security. She had achieved everything she wanted, and she was not about to let her sisters ruin it. When Maggie or Kate expressed doubts, when they talked about confessing or stopping, Leah would shut them down. Sometimes with logic. You'll destroy thousands of people's faith. You'll break their hearts. Sometimes with guilt. After all I've done for you, this is how you repay me. And sometimes with threats. If you confess, you'll be humiliated, hated. You'll never work again. You'll end up in the gutter. The sisters were trapped not just by the lie, but by Leah's iron control. But then, in 1852, something happened that offered Maggie a glimpse of escape. His name was Elisha Kent Kane, and he was one of the most famous men in America. Kane was an Arctic explorer, a surgeon, a naval officer, and an adventurer. He had led expeditions into the frozen north in search of the lost Franklin expedition. He had survived near-death experiences, frostbite, scurvy, and starvation. He had written best-selling books about his adventures. He was handsome, charismatic, educated, and from one of Philadelphia's wealthiest families. He was also appalled by spiritualism. Kane attended one of the Fox sisters' seances in Philadelphia in 1852. He was there as a skeptic, determined to expose the fraud. But instead of exposing it, he fell in love with Maggie. She was 18 or 19 years old, pretty, fragile, clearly unhappy. And Kane, with the arrogance of a wealthy man who was used to solving problems, decided he would save her. He began writing to her. At first, the letters were about spiritualism. He was convinced she was being exploited, that she should give up mediumship and pursue an education instead. But the letters quickly became more personal, more romantic. Maggie, starved for any kind of genuine connection, fell for him completely. Kane promised her everything. He would take care of her. He would pay for her education. They would marry. She would leave the seances, leave Leah, leave the whole spiritualist world behind and start a new life. For Maggie, this was salvation, a way out of the lie, a chance at normalcy. There was just one problem: Kane's family. The Kanes were Philadelphia society, wealthy, established, conservative. They did not approve of their son courting a spiritualist medium from a poor farming family. They especially did not approve of the idea of marriage. Kane, caught between love and family obligation, began to waffle. He still wrote passionate letters to Maggie. He still said he loved her, but he also started saying things like, "We need to wait," and "Let me work on my family," and "Perhaps we should keep this relationship private for now." Maggie understood what this meant. He would not defy his family. She would never be his wife, but she clung to hope anyway, because hope was all she had. On Kane's urging, Maggie did stop performing seances for a period. She converted to Catholicism. Kane was Catholic and believed this would make his family more accepting. She tried to become the respectable woman Kane wanted her to be. And then, in 1857, Elisha Kent Kane died. He was only 37 years old. He had never fully recovered from the hardships of his Arctic expeditions, and a fever took him quickly. Maggie was devastated. But even in her grief, she faced another blow. Kane's family denied that he had ever intended to marry her. They claimed she was delusional, that Kane had only shown her Christian charity, that there had been no engagement and no promises. Maggie had letters, passionate, romantic letters, that proved otherwise. But without a formal engagement or marriage, she had no claim on his estate and no social standing as his widow. She was left with nothing. Again. And so, despite everything, despite the guilt, despite the pain, despite her own conscience, Maggie returned to mediumship, because it was the only way she knew how to survive. Meanwhile, Kate's life had taken a different path. In the late 1850s and early 1860s, Kate's reputation as a medium had grown to equal or even surpass Maggie's. She was considered the more gifted of the two, the one whose rappings were clearer, whose spirits were more communicative. In 1871, Kate was invited to England, sponsored by wealthy patrons who wanted to introduce spiritualism to British society. She spent several years there, performing seances for aristocrats and intellectuals. One of her supporters was William Crookes, a respected physicist and chemist. Crookes investigated Kate's mediumship under what he considered controlled conditions and declared her genuine. He published papers claiming that she demonstrated paranormal abilities that could not be explained by fraud. However, Crookes was later criticized, even by fellow scientists, for being far too credulous. His experimental controls were laughably inadequate. He allowed Kate to dictate the conditions of the seances. He was, in short, exactly the kind of well-meaning but easily fooled investigator that any competent performer could manipulate. But his endorsement mattered. It gave spiritualism scientific credibility, or at least the appearance of it. In 1872, Kate married. Her husband was Henry Jenkin, a London barrister, a respected professional from a good family. They had 2 sons together. For a brief period, Kate seems to have been genuinely happy. But then, in 1881, Henry Jenkin died suddenly. Kate was a widow with 2 young sons, no money, and no way to support herself except through the one skill she had. She returned to seances. She returned to America. She returned to the lie. And she began to drink. Both sisters, by the 1880s, were alcoholics. The exact progression is unclear. When did occasional wine to steady the nerves become daily drinking, become full-blown addiction? But the result was unmistakable. Kate's drinking became so severe that she could barely function. Her seances became erratic. Sometimes the spirits wouldn't come. Sometimes she would fall asleep in the middle of a session. Her sons were often neglected. Leah, now in her 60s and still very much in control of the family business, was furious. Kate's drinking was bad for the brand. It made all mediums look disreputable. It threatened everything Leah had built. And so Leah did something unforgivable. She began a campaign to have Kate declared an unfit mother. She worked with other spiritualist leaders to suggest that Kate's children should be taken from her and placed in the care of responsible adults. For Kate, this was the final betrayal. After decades of exploitation, after being turned into a performing animal, after having her entire life controlled and manipulated, now Leah wanted to take her children. Kate reached out to Maggie. The two sisters, both broken by alcohol and grief and the accumulated weight of 40 years of lying, made a pact. They would destroy it all. They would confess, publicly, dramatically. They would expose spiritualism as a fraud, expose Leah as an exploiter, and burn the whole empire to the ground. If they couldn't escape the lie, they would at least have the satisfaction of watching it die. They contacted a reporter from the New York World. They negotiated a fee, $1,500 for an exclusive confession, and they scheduled a public demonstration, October 21st, 1888. The New York Academy of Music, the confession that would shock the world, except, as we've seen, the world did not want to be shocked. The world did not want the truth, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. Because before we can understand why the confession failed, we need to see the final years of the sisters' decline. We need to see how the lie slowly destroyed them from the inside. We need to see how success, in the end, was worse than failure could ever have been. The 1880s were not kind to Maggie and Kate Fox. They were in their 40s now, middle-aged women in an era when middle age came early and lasted briefly. They had spent their entire adult lives as mediums, had performed thousands of seances, had told tens of thousands of comforting lies to grieving people, and they were exhausted. The physical demands of mediumship, maintaining concentration for hours, cracking joints repeatedly, staying in character as passive vessels for spirit communication, had taken their toll. Both sisters suffered from chronic joint pain. Maggie's toes, in particular, were damaged from decades of deliberately dislocating the joints to produce wraps. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the psychological and spiritual damage. Maggie, especially, was tormented by guilt. She had never fully made peace with what they were doing. The memory of Elisha Kane haunted her. He had wanted her to give up mediumship, had seen it as corrupting and exploitative. His death had forced her back into the life he had tried to save her from. She would sometimes, after seances, drink until she passed out. It was the only way she could quiet the voices of the dead, not the fake spirits she pretended to channel, but the real dead she felt she had betrayed. Kane, her parents, the innocent believers who trusted her. Kate's drinking was even worse. Where Maggie drank to forget, Kate drank just to function. She needed alcohol to get through the day, to perform seances, to interact with people. Her children, two young boys, Ferdinand and Henry, were often left to fend for themselves, while their mother lay unconscious or weeping. It was a terrible existence for them, and everyone could see it. Enter Leah Fox, now Leah Fox Underhill, after her second marriage. Leah was in her 60s, wealthy, respected as a leader in the spiritualist movement. She had published books, given lectures, established herself as a voice of authority, and she watched her younger sisters decline with a mixture of disgust and alarm. Not because she cared about Maggie and Kate's well-being. Leah had proven over decades that she viewed her sisters primarily as assets to be managed, but because their behavior threatened the movement. A drunk medium was bad optics. It gave skeptics ammunition. It made all spiritualists look like frauds and charlatans. Leah began a pressure campaign. She publicly criticized Kate's drinking. She told other spiritualist leaders that Kate was an embarrassment, and she began suggesting that Kate's sons should be removed from her care. At first, this was just talk, but then Leah made it official. She worked with social reformers and legal authorities to have Kate's fitness as a mother investigated. In 1888, Kate's children were temporarily placed in the care of others, while Kate's situation was assessed. For Kate, this was apocalyptic. Her children were all she had. They were the one good, pure thing in her life. And now Leah, Sister Leah, who had turned her into a performing fraud at age 11, who had controlled and exploited her for 40 years, was trying to take them away. Kate was furious, but she was also helpless. She had no money of her own. Leah had always controlled the finances. She had no legal standing. She was a known alcoholic. The authorities were more likely to side with Leah, the respectable matron, than with Kate, the broken drunk. Unless she had leverage. Unless she could threaten Leah with something so devastating that Leah would have to back off. Kate reached out to Maggie. They met in secret. Two middle-aged women, both alcoholics, both trapped in lives they never wanted. And they made a plan. They would confess. Not privately, not quietly, but publicly, dramatically, in a way that could not be ignored or covered up. They would go to the newspapers and tell the truth, that it had all been a fraud from the beginning, that there were no spirits, that every rap, every message, every communication with the dead had been a lie. They would destroy spiritualism. They would expose the movement as built on nothing but toe-cracking and gullibility. And most of all, they would destroy Leah. They would expose her as the mastermind, the exploiter, the woman who had knowingly perpetuated a massive fraud for 40 years. It was revenge. Pure, simple, total revenge. The New York World was happy to oblige. The newspaper offered to pay $1,500, a substantial sum, for an exclusive confession and public demonstration. The editor understood what he had, the scoop of the decade. The founders of spiritualism admitting it was all fake. The event was scheduled for October the 21st, 1888, at the New York Academy of Music. In the weeks leading up to the confession, there were rumors, whispers that something big was going to happen. Some spiritualists tried to stop it. They approached Maggie and Kate, pleading with them, threatening them, offering them money to stay silent. But Maggie and Kate were past caring. They had made their decision. The night of October 21st arrived. The Academy of Music was packed. 2,000 people crammed into every seat, standing in the aisles, pressing against the walls. The audience was split between those who wanted to hear the confession and those who came to denounce it. Kate sat in the front row. Maggie took the stage. We've already seen what happened. The confession, the demonstration, the toe-cracking that produced the famous raps, the doctors from the audience verifying that it was real. But what we haven't fully explored is the immediate aftermath. The newspapers the next day were ecstatic. "Death blow to spiritualism," proclaimed the headlines. Fox sisters confess massive fraud. Spirits were just toe joints all along. The mainstream press loved it. For years, newspapers had been skeptical of spiritualism, had called it superstition and fraud. Now they had proof. The founders themselves had confessed. But the reaction from spiritualists was not what Maggie and Kate expected. They did not believe the confession, or rather, They believed the confession was the fraud, not the mediumship. Within days, spiritualist newspapers and leaders began explaining why the confession didn't matter. Their arguments were creative. Some said Maggie was lying now to get money, and that she had been a genuine medium all along. Some said that evil spirits had forced her to confess, that dark forces were trying to destroy spiritualism by manipulating its founders. Some said that Leah had paid Maggie to confess in order to discredit Kate and justify taking her children. This theory made no sense, but people believed it anyway. Some said that even if the Fox sisters had faked their rappings, that didn't mean all mediums were frauds. Other mediums were still genuine. And some said the most audacious thing of all, that the Fox sisters were genuine mediums, but they didn't understand their own powers. That the raps really did come from spirits, but the spirits worked through the sisters' toe joints as a mechanism. That the physical explanation didn't invalidate the spiritual one. This last argument is worth pausing on because it reveals something profound about human belief. When confronted with evidence that contradicts what we want to be true, we don't abandon the belief. We reframe the evidence to fit the belief. The Fox sisters confessed, and the spiritualist movement barely blinked. Maggie and Kate had expected to be vindicated. They had expected people to say, "Thank you for telling the truth." They had expected, in some vague way, to be free. Instead, they were vilified by spiritualists as traitors and liars. And they were pitied by skeptics as pathetic women who had destroyed themselves. Worse, they were broke. The $1,500 from the New York World ran out quickly. No one wanted to hire them for seances anymore. Spiritualists hated them, and skeptics had no use for them. Leah, meanwhile, was fine. She issued a statement denying everything Maggie had said. She claimed her sisters were lying, were drunk, were mentally unstable. And because Leah was respectable and well-connected, people believed her. In 1889, 1 year after the confession, Maggie recanted. She published a statement saying that she had been wrong to confess, that she really was a medium, that the spirits had begged her to recant, to tell the world that spiritualism was real. Why did she do this? The charitable interpretation is that she genuinely needed money, and the only way to get it was to return to mediumship. The less charitable interpretation is that she was drunk and confused and being manipulated by people who wanted her to recant. The truth is probably both. The recantation convinced no one. Spiritualists didn't trust her anymore. Skeptics just saw it as more evidence that she was a fraud. Maggie Fox had tried to tell the truth, and no one believed her. Then she tried to take back the truth, and no one believed that either. She had destroyed her credibility so completely that nothing she said mattered anymore. In 1890, Leah Fox Underhill died. She was 77 years old. She died wealthy, respected, surrounded by friends and admirers. She never recanted, never confessed, never admitted to any wrongdoing. Maggie and Kate did not attend her funeral. In 1892, Kate Fox Jenkins died. She was 55 years old, though her body was that of a much older woman. The official cause of death was kidney disease, but the real cause was alcoholism. She died estranged from her sons, alone in a small apartment in New York City. She had no money. Friends raised funds to bury her properly in Cypress Hills Cemetery in Brooklyn. In 1893, less than a year later, Maggie Fox Kane died. She was 59 years old. The cause was a heart attack, though again, Decades of alcoholism had destroyed her body. She died alone in a friend's home. She had been living on charity for months. She owned almost nothing. Her entire life's work, 40 years as the most famous medium in America, had left her penniless and broken. Friends raised money for her burial. She was interred next to Kate in Cypress Hills Cemetery. Two sisters, who had changed the world with a lie, were buried side by side in graves paid for by charity. And spiritualism, it continued, thrived even. The deaths of the Fox sisters were treated as tragic, but irrelevant to the truth of spirit communication. New mediums rose to take their place. The movement adapted, evolved, spread. The lie had become bigger than the liars. It had achieved immortality. And the two women who had created it were forgotten, remembered only as tragic footnotes, if they were remembered at all. But there is one final twist to this story, one last strange detail that keeps the mystery alive even today. In 1904, 11 years after Maggie's death, a wall in the cellar of the old Fox cottage in Hydesville collapsed. Beneath it, in the earth, were bones, human bones. Or were they? The initial report said human remains. But when a physician examined them, he found that the skeleton was actually a random collection of bones, including chicken bones and other animal remains. Someone, probably as a prank, had buried them there years earlier. But spiritualists ignored the physician's report. They focused on the initial finding. See, they said, there really was a body in the cellar. Charles Rosner, the peddler, was real. The spirits were telling the truth all along, and some people still believe it today. The truth and the lie are so tangled now that they can never be fully separated. And maybe that's fitting, because the Fox sisters' greatest trick was not the rapping. It was not the seances or the messages from the dead. Their greatest trick was teaching the world how to believe in spite of evidence. How to want something so badly that you'll ignore any proof to the contrary. That trick is immortal. Let's return to that stage. October 21st, 1888. Maggie Fox, removing her shoe, placing her foot on the stool, and cracking her toes for a crowd of 2,000 people. Rap, rap, rap. The sound that launched a religion. She had just told everyone the truth. She had demonstrated, clearly and irrefutably, that the raps were produced by cracking her joints. She had explained how it all started, how it spiraled out of control, how she and Kate had been trapped in the lie for 40 years. She had told the truth, and it didn't matter. This is the part of the story that haunts me, not the fraud itself. Fraud is common enough. Not even the exploitation, though that's tragic. What haunts me is the failure of truth. Because Maggie Fox did exactly what we always say people should do. When you've told a lie, especially a consequential lie, you're supposed to come clean, confess, tell the truth, face the consequences. She did that. And the world said, no, we prefer the lie. Why? Let's start with the obvious. People had built their lives around spiritualism. By 1888, there were millions of believers. There were spiritualist churches, spiritualist newspapers, spiritualist communities. People had based their understanding of death, of the afterlife, of their deceased loved ones, on the premise that mediums could communicate with spirits. Maggie's confession threatened all of that. It said, everything you believed was based on a prank. Your dead child cannot speak to you. Your deceased spouse is not watching over you. Death is just death. That's unbearable. It's psychologically easier to believe that Maggie was lying about lying than to accept that death is final. But there's something deeper going on here. Something about human nature and belief. People don't believe things because they're true. We believe things because they're useful, because they make us feel better, because they give our lives meaning, because they connect us to communities, because they help us cope with things that are too painful to face directly. Spiritualism was useful. It gave grieving mothers a way to feel connected to their dead children. It gave widows comfort. It gave people hope. It offered proof, tangible, testable proof, that death was not the end. Was it true? That almost didn't matter. It worked. It helped people. And that was enough. This is not unique to spiritualism. Every religion, every ideology, every belief system has to grapple with the question, what do we do when evidence contradicts belief? And almost always, belief wins. We reframe the evidence. We attack the credibility of the source. We say, yes, but that doesn't disprove the fundamental truth. We move the goalposts. The Fox sisters confessed, and spiritualists said, well, maybe they were frauds, but that doesn't mean all mediums are frauds. Scientific studies debunked medium after medium, and believers said, you just haven't tested the right medium yet. The basic human hunger to believe in an afterlife, to believe that consciousness continues, to believe that we can speak to those we've lost, that hunger is so strong that it overwhelms evidence. And that brings us to the question of whether Maggie and Kate Fox were victims or villains. The easy answer is both. They were victims of their older sister's exploitation, victims of a society that gave them no other way to make a living, victims of their own childhood prank that spiraled beyond their control. But they were also complicit. They kept the lie going for 40 years. They took money from grieving people. They told mothers that their dead children were happy and at peace. They built careers on fraud. Can both things be true? Can someone be both victim and perpetrator? I think they can. I think most human stories are like this, more complicated than simple moral categories allow. Maggie and Kate were children when it started. They were trapped by circumstances they didn't fully understand, and by the time they were adults, the lie had become so big that confessing seemed impossible. Until finally, broken and desperate, they tried to confess and discovered that even confession couldn't free them. The tragedy of the Fox sisters is not that they lied. People lie all the time. The tragedy is that they told the truth and no one cared. They died in poverty. They died as alcoholics. They died estranged from their family, pitied by some and hated by others. And spiritualism continued without them. Today, more than 130 years after Maggie's confession, spiritualism still exists. There are spiritualist churches in America, Britain, and other countries. They hold services. They have mediums who claim to communicate with the dead. They have believers who find comfort in the practice. Are these modern mediums frauds? Some of them, certainly. Are some of them sincere believers in their own abilities? Probably. Are some of them skilled cold readers who have convinced themselves that they have genuine gifts? Almost certainly. But it all traces back to that night in March 1848, to two little girls in a farmhouse, cracking their toes in the darkness, terrifying their mother. The Fox sisters didn't just create spiritualism, they created a template. They showed the world how to market grief, how to turn hope into profit, how to build a belief system that's immune to evidence. Every psychic medium on television today, every person who claims to speak to the dead, every seance and ghost hunt and paranormal investigation, they're all descendants of Maggie and Kate Fox. Harry Houdini spent the last years of his life trying to debunk spiritualism. He exposed medium after medium as frauds. He offered rewards to anyone who could demonstrate genuine paranormal abilities under controlled conditions. No one ever claimed the reward. Houdini understood something important. Spiritualism was not really about the mediums. It was about the audience. It was about the human need to believe. And you can't debunk a need. The Fox sisters taught us that lesson. They confessed to the fraud, demonstrated how it was done, explained everything, and it changed nothing, because the truth was less comforting than the lie. So here's my question for you. If you were in their position, what would you have done? If you had started a lie as a child, and it spiraled into something huge, and millions of people believed it, and entire communities were built on it, and confessing would hurt all those people and destroy all that faith, would you confess? Or would you keep the lie going, tell yourself that it's doing more good than harm, that people need the comfort even if it's false? And if you did confess and no one believed you, what would that feel like? To tell the truth and have it rejected? These are not easy questions, and I don't have good answers. What I do know is this. Maggie and Kate Fox were two little girls who discovered something fundamental about human nature. They discovered that people want to believe in magic, in miracles, in the possibility that death is not the end. And once you give people that magic, even if you created it with nothing but cracking your toes in the darkness, you can never take it back. The lie becomes bigger than you. The lie becomes immortal. And you, the liar, become its prisoner forever. The Fox sisters lived and died in that prison. They tried to escape through confession, through truth, through burning it all down. And the prison remained, stronger than ever. This has been the Midnight Archives. Keep the candle lit, because in the darkness we tell ourselves stories. Some of those stories are true, some are false, and the scariest ones are the ones where we can't tell the difference anymore.